Good evening, and welcome back to the Pastor Study. We currently live in a world that can provide for a host of disappointments. Certainly, the fear of the pandemic that we're dealing with has the ability to impact us pretty severely. Even if we or the people in our family or our close circles manage to miss the virus and never test positive. The lack of freedom that we deal with, the freedom that we've been so accustomed to having to go in whatever we want and go where we want and not worry about being infected or did someone clean the motel room well before we moved in. So of course, what the pandemic has done to our financial structure is extremely scary, and that seems to be getting worse. You add to that the mental health issues that are now beginning to become endemic to dealing with this pandemic. You add to that the fact that 50% or almost 50% of our country is very dissatisfied with the results of the presidential election. And it certainly leaves plenty of room for disillusionment, disappointment, frustration, fear. I've even heard some people ask if God has abandoned America. Now, I certainly don't want to speak for God in that area. I'll leave that to the prophets, of whom I am not one of them. My gifting is not prophecy. My gifting is pastoral ministry. However, I will say this. Pandemics are not new to this world. Scientists and historians tell us that they seem to happen about every 100 years or so. They are a part of the fact that we live in a fallen world, whether we like it or not. A world where Satan has had some impact, especially where sickness and disease are concerned. But what I would like to do this morning, or this evening rather, is in the next few minutes share with you two passages of Scripture. I think that, or at least I hope, will impact you positively in the process. What I've been describing and the emotions that go along with it are certainly nothing new to God's people. In Isaiah chapter 49, God's people are asking the same questions. They're asking, has God forgotten about us? God's chosen people, the ones that he brought out of Egypt, out of slavery, he carried them to the promised land, took them across the Red Sea and destroyed the Egyptian army behind them. Carried them for 40 years through the promised land and then, or through the wilderness and then into the promised land. And now, about 700 or so years before Jesus, they're asking the question, has God forgotten about us? In this instance, God steps into the conversation through the prophet Isaiah, and here's what he says in verse 15 and following. He says, can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she's born? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palm of my hands. Your walls are ever before me. God told them, and he tells us today, that no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, or no matter what's going on, he has not forgotten about us, and he has not abandoned us. Now, we've all seen mothers hold and love on their babies. Some of us have done the same thing to our children and our grandchildren. But there's a bond between a parent and an infant child that's hard to explain. But it is an extremely strong bond. A mother can tell her child's cry in a nursery in the midst of a bunch of other crying children. I've never understood it. But a mother can walk into a room of crying children and hear hers in the middle of that. She not only does not forget her child or forget about her child, she listens for that child's needs. Even when the child does not know how to express them or realize that they have needs, the mother knows what that child needs. And then God says, even if that bond should fail, should it be forgotten, I will not forget you. The second passage I want to share with you is found in Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 17. The prophet Zephaniah speaks to his people, and he gives them this promise from God. He will rejoice over you. You will rest in his love, and he will sing and be joyful about you. It sounds to me like God thinks we're pretty special. He's joyful about us. He actually rejoices over us. And in God's eyes, it doesn't matter whether we're on the right or the wrong side of the tracks. It doesn't matter whether we have the coronavirus or not. From a perspective of his love for us, it doesn't matter to him whether whether our tithe is a small amount or a large amount. God's concern is for us individually as his sons and as his daughters. I know that I don't often, or I frequently don't rejoice about myself. But I know that my feelings quite often don't line up with God's heart and his mind and his word. And when I don't feel like God is rejoicing over me, I've got to remind myself that's not what Scripture says. Scripture says he is rejoicing over me regardless of how I feel about it at the moment. And when that happens, it's then up to me to make the changes in my mind because God doesn't need to make any changes. So despite the circumstances, which can be pretty grim when we give them very much attention, God has not forgotten about us, and he will not forget about us. In fact, right now, he is remembering you, he is thinking about you, and he is rejoicing about you. And I think that makes us pretty special, whether we feel like it or not. Regardless of the pandemic swirling around us, regardless of the unemployment scenario, regardless of what happens or doesn't happen with the vaccines, God's love for us has not diminished. It will not fail. He will not forget about us, and he will not cease rejoicing over us. And Zephaniah said, rejoicing about us. And I think that's a pretty special place to be. And I look forward to seeing you next time in the Pastor Study. God's blessings to you.